There are currently more than 11 million empty houses in Japan. This number is comparable to the population of the Czech Republic. In other words, if all the citizens of the Czech Republic moved to Japan, each citizen could have one house to himself. IKEA, as the Japanese call abandoned houses, is given away for free by the Japanese government under certain conditions. The number of abandoned houses is increasing all the time, and estimates state that by 2033, more than a third of the houses in Japan will be standing empty. But how did all this happen? To understand this phenomenon, we have to go all the way back to the 1970s. Japan's economic miracle during this period exceeded the wildest expectations, including those of the United States, which had no small part in it. In the 1970s, Japan, recovering from the oil shock, began to catch up with the USA, becoming the second largest economy in the world, and by the end of the 1980s it was in first place in terms of per capita GDP. It was at this time that the Japanese were the richest citizens walking the earth. Over time, the US trade balance suffered more and more. At that time, among other things, due to the high dollar exchange rate. The Ronald Reagan administration decided to remind Japan, and incidentally also the Federal Republic of Germany, that the US umbrella costs money. An international agreement was reached among the then 5 economic powers of the G5 world: France, the Federal Republic of Germany, Japan, the United States, and the United Kingdom. As a result of US intervention, which went down in history as the Plaza Accord, after the name of the New York hotel where the agreement was concluded on 22 September 1985, which led, among other things, to a twofold appreciation of the yen against the dollar. In the aftermath of these events, anticipating a slowdown in Japan's export-oriented economy, the country's central bank cut interest rates. Huge amounts of funds had accumulated in the automobile, steel, and electronics industries, so that Japanese industry did not need additional cheap capital. Leaving interest rates unchanged or raising them would most likely be much more beneficial in the long term. In a situation where the industrial sector did not need cheap financing, the funds pumped in by the central bank went to the financial sector. Such an action very quickly bore fruit. Investment levels reached record levels. Within 4 years, the Nikkei 225 index almost tripled in value, and the real estate boom made real estate cost the most in history. At one point, the value of land in Tokyo was equal to the value of land in the entire United States. The scale of the euphoria at the time can be seen in the fact that, at the peak of the bubble, 1 square kilometer of the Imperial Palace grounds in the center of Tokyo was worth more than the entire area of the state of California, with its 424,000 square kilometers and being the richest place in the world. Between 1986 and 1990, the monetary base grew by 10.5% a year. The cost of money fell from 5% in 1985. Bubble burst. The Bank of Japan, fearing a bubble, decided to cool down investor enthusiasm, and in 1990 raised the interest rate to 6%. Unfortunately, the scenario of slow stabilization and cautious prevention did not work. The decision to raise the interest rate led to a big bump. The giant bubble burst. The Nikkei index, which had risen enormously and reached a record high of almost 40,000 points in December 1989, fell to 15,000 points in 1992. This represents a fall of some 63% in a dozen months. By 2003, the Nikkei was at levels last seen in the early 1980s. The situation was even worse in the property market, where prices fell by more than 80% between 1991 and 1998. The situation in the capital and property markets described above was followed by other disastrous events. The unemployment rate rose from around 2% in 1991 to 4.7% within a decade. Dealing with the aftermath of the bubble burst and liquidity trap concerns. A liquidity trap is a situation in which traditional monetary policy no longer works. This happens when interest rates move towards zero, so that the central bank loses the ability to maneuver the most important of its traditional monetary policy instruments. Another important indicator of a liquidity trap is the attitude of consumers, who are affected by the crisis and therefore avoid all securities, including bonds. Cash thus became the king of Japanese reserves. The reason was fear of the future. For the same reason, current consumption did not grow. Since the other side of low purchases is lower sales by companies, the economy went into a slump despite the high share of exports. Fiscal policy can sometimes be an effective remedy for a liquidity trap. It needs to be loose and involve cutting taxes, introducing tax breaks, and increasing spending from public funds. The Japanese tried very hard, but things did not go as they wanted. They poured money into inefficient infrastructure projects. They bailed out failing companies that survived but were unable to revive the economy. According to Nakaso Hiroshi, a former deputy governor of the Bank of Japan and a former participant in the central bank's anti-crisis ventures, in an attempt to restore financial stability, the Japanese economy received as much as 70 trillion yen from public sources, equivalent to 648 billion at the exchange rate of the time and 14% of annual GDP in nominal terms. Fiscal and monetary easing was huge, but ineffective in getting the economy going. And it had to end with huge budget deficits covered by borrowing. Figures vary, but it is certain that Japan's current public debt is at least more than twice nominal GDP. According to many forecasts, the ratio will reach 230% by the end of 2023, up from 44.6% in December 1982. To give the full picture, it should be added that the Japanese government owns large foreign assets, so its net debt is about 100 percentage points lower. However you look at it, Japan has been at or near the top of any debt list for years. U.S. financier Ray Dalio wrote in 2015 that if you count private debt, Japan's total debt is as high as 450% of GDP. Close to the truth or not, Dalio's figure is less important than its implications. Well, even with extremely low interest rates, with such a level of debt, the cost of servicing it is very high, limiting investment capacity, and thus Japan's economic growth. Despite so much effort and prolonged monetary and fiscal intervention, Japan's economy has not moved forward. From 1995 to 2022, GDP has fallen from 5.5 trillion in 1995 to 4.9 trillion in 2022. Demographic collapse and migration of Japanese to large centers like Tokyo, Yokohama, and Osaka. The number of children born in Japan last year was the lowest since 1899. Only 770,000 babies were born, the lowest number since statistics have been kept, according to Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare. The number of deaths was the highest in the post-war period. There were 40,875 fewer babies born in 2022 than in the previous year. The number of births in the country has been declining for 7 years. The fertility rate fell by 0.04 percentage points year-on-year to 1.26, the same level as in 2005 and the lowest on record. A level of around 2.1 is considered to be a level that ensures the interchangeability of generations in a given society. During the first baby boom, 1947-1949, immediately after the end of the Second World War, the number of births in Japan reached 2.5 million per year. And during the second, 1971 to 1974, it exceeded 2 million. In 2007, the number of births fell below the number of deaths for the first time, according to Nippon Portal. The number of Japanese has thus fallen by 3 million since 2007, from 128 million to 125 million today. And this is only the beginning of Japan's population decline. The EFE news agency reminds us that Japan has the oldest population in the world. Seniors in Japan account for almost 30% of the population. In second place is Italy, where seniors make up 23.6% of the population. And in third place is Portugal with 23.1%. Government efforts to encourage people to have more children have so far had a limited impact on fertility rates, despite financial support for pregnant women and childcare. At the end of May, Prime Minister Kishida pledged to double spending on childcare over the next 3 years in a bid to reverse the country's falling birth rate. On the one hand, one could say that what is happening in Japan is not unusual. On the other hand, more and more people are moving from the provinces to the big cities for better jobs, and fewer children are being born due to the liberalization of social life. In Japan, however, these problems are at their worst. Researchers have been warning for years that the nation is slowly but surely heading for extinction. The fertility rate is one of the lowest in the world, hovering around 1.1, which is far from enough to replace the generations. Senior citizens already account for 1/4 of the population, and this proportion will rise to 40% in the next 50 years. At the same time, people of working age will account for less than 50% of the population. This is already affecting the Japanese economy, which has been stagnating for many years, and the forecasts remain extremely worrying. The island of Hashima, colloquially known as Ship Island, can be seen as an apocalyptic vision of Japan's future. Located 15 kilometers from the city of Nagasaki, it is one of around 500 surrounding uninhabited islands. Its history is a mirror of Japan's economic development. Until 1974, Hashima was a coal mining center. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Mitsubishi Corporation invested money here, fortifying the island's shores and gradually increasing production to 150,000 tons a year. Housing was also built for more than 3,000 workers. During the Second World War, Hashima was one of the components of Japan's defense system, only to return to its former function after 1945. But its heyday came to an end when oil took over the world's energy markets. The gradual decline of coal mining continued until 1974, when the mine was officially closed. Nichitsu is also known as a ghost town. Situated in the central part of the country, far from major centers, the town developed around a nearby mine that was established after the Second World War. At the height of its development, up to 3,000 people lived there. Unfortunately, Nichitsu shared the fate of Hashima and was abandoned as soon as it was founded. Today, the town looks as if it was hit by a violent natural disaster and the population suddenly left overnight. This is due to the peculiarities of Japanese society, whose members do not pay much attention to things and value community. As a result, spontaneous explorations, such as the Japanese version of urbex, urban exploring, known in the West, haikyo, can sometimes be the source of extraordinary discoveries of everyday objects, furniture, appliances, toys, but also documents or publications. The variety and number of abandoned sites in Japan has meant that at least some of them have become increasingly popular tourist attractions. Unfortunately, this is a grim phenomenon with lessons for societies around the world. Technological progress has always led to the urbanization and subsequent de-urbanization of certain areas. The process generally follows a similar pattern. Man settles in, makes use of local resources, and then leaves his footprints in the space, usually unfavorably. When observing abandoned places in Japan, it is worth considering the impact of human development on the environment. It is worth remembering that from the planning stage of a development, care must be taken to plan for the reclamation of the land invested and to help the people involved in a project who may become completely useless overnight. Many of today's Japanese adults in their 50s and 60s no longer live in the places where they grew up. Over the course of their lives, they have moved closer to urban centers. Their parents, on the other hand, have remained in the homes they once occupied. After the death of their elders, most Japanese are unable to sell the family home due to the lack of people willing to live in the desolate Japanese suburbs. In addition, the secondary market is not very popular in Japan. Traditional suburban homes that are not properly maintained quickly lose value due to their condition. This is one of the reasons why residents value the primary market. And here we have the answer to why there are so many empty houses. First, the huge building boom of the 1980s, which ended in a crash unprecedented in modern history. And secondly, the demographic collapse and migration to the big centers. Akiya, or empty houses, is a phenomenon from our Western perspective. But to understand the current situation, historical, cultural, and economic conditions are key. Thank you for watching the video. Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. See you next video.